I set the small white stick down on the kitchen counter between us, and Dean Ashford looked at it the way a man looks at a bill he was hoping never to receive. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question. An accusation dressed up as one. "Out of my own trash can," I said, which tells me my daughter was standing in my kitchen, alone, holding the biggest news of her life and too afraid to tell her own father. "I'd like you to explain to me why that is." He recovered fast. Men like Dean always do. "Robert, I don't know what Claire's told you, but this is between us. It's not something you need to—" "She's my daughter," I said, and I kept my voice level. The way I've kept my voice level through 31 years of standing on porches delivering bad news along with the mail. Everything about her life is something I need to. I watched something shift behind his eyes. The calculation of a man realizing the ground under him wasn't as solid as he'd thought. He didn't know yet how much I'd already learned about him in the 2 weeks since I'd found that test in my trash can. He didn't know about the ring I'd found photographed on another woman's hand, or the phone call I'd made to a city council office, or the conversation I'd had with his own mother over coffee she didn't know I'd requested for a reason. He was about to. 2 weeks earlier, I hadn't known any of it either. 2 weeks earlier, I thought my biggest problem was a slow Tuesday on my mail route and a knee that ached worse every winter. I want to tell you how I got from that ordinary Tuesday to this kitchen, because I think there's something in it worth hearing about the secrets our children keep to protect us, and the ones we sometimes have to uncover to protect them back. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 60 years old, and until 2 years ago, I spent 31 years as a mail carrier in Dayton, Ohio, walking the same 6-mile route through the same neighborhood so many times I could tell you which dog barked at which hour and whose porch light needed a new bulb before the homeowner noticed it themselves. I retired with a pension, a bad knee, and more knowledge of my community than most people gather in a lifetime. Because there's a particular kind of trust people place in the man who brings their mail every day, rain or shine, for 3 decades. You become part of the furniture of a street. You become someone people wave at without quite knowing why they trust you, except that you've always been there. My wife Diane passed 9 years ago, a car accident on a wet November night. The kind of thing that happens so fast there's no warning, no slow decline to prepare for, just an ordinary Tuesday evening that ends everything. I don't dwell on the details often, not because they don't still hurt, but because dwelling on them has never brought her back. And I learned a long time ago that grief is something you carry forward with you, not something you solve. What I carry from her, more than the grief, is the way she used to talk to our daughter. Patient, direct, never raising her voice even when she was furious, always making Claire feel like the truth, however hard, was a safer place to stand than a lie. Claire is 24 now. She was 15 when her mother died, which is a brutal age to lose a parent. Old enough to understand exactly what she was losing. Young enough to still need the thing she'd lost. I did my best in the years after. I won't pretend I did it perfectly. There were nights I didn't know how to talk to a teenage girl about things her mother would have known instinctively. Dinners where we sat in a silence neither of us knew how to break. Birthdays where I could see her missing her mother in a way I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. But we got through it together. And somewhere in those difficult years, Claire and I built something I'm proud of. An honesty between us that felt, for a long time, unbreakable. She works as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, talented enough that I don't fully understand half of what she shows me on her laptop screen, though I nod along and tell her it looks wonderful, because it usually does. She lives 20 minutes from me in a small apartment near the river, close enough that we see each other most weekends, far enough that she has her own life, her own friends, her own rhythm that doesn't revolve around her father. I was proud of that independence. I still am. It's part of what made the 8 months I'm about to describe so disorienting. Watching a young woman who had always told me everything slowly become someone who told me almost nothing at all. I am, by nature, a quiet man. 31 years of walking a male route alone with your thoughts does something to a person. Makes you observant in a way that doesn't always announce itself. Makes you patient in a way some people mistake for passivity. I notice things. I've always noticed things. The neighbor whose marriage was ending months before anyone else knew. The family down the block quietly struggling before they asked for help. The small daily details that tell you the truth about a life long before anyone says it out loud. I didn't expect I'd need that particular skill to understand my own daughter. I found out I did. My days now are simpler than they used to be. Coffee on my back porch most mornings. A woodworking hobby I picked up after retirement that fills the garage with the smell of sawdust and gives my hands something to do. Dinner most Sundays with Claire when our schedules allow it. It's a good life, a quiet one, built carefully in the years since Diane died. I tell you all this because I want you to understand what kind of man I was before this story started. Steady, watchful, not easily rattled. And I want you to understand how completely that steadiness was tested by watching my daughter disappear piece by piece into a relationship I didn't fully understand until it was almost too late to help her. Claire met Dean Ashford in the spring at a networking event for her firm. She called me that weekend, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard from her in a while. "Dad, I met someone. He's a little older, works with his family's law firm, kind of a big deal around City Hall stuff. He's really put together, you know, like he's got his whole life figured out." I remember feeling something small and cautious stir in me at kind of a big deal, the way I always did whenever Claire described a man by his status rather than his character. I told myself it was nothing. Young people describe new relationships in whatever terms excite them most, and I didn't want to be the father who found suspicion in every ordinary sentence. The first time I met Dean at a dinner Claire arranged at my house in early June, he was polished in a way that made me instantly aware of my own sawdust-covered garage and modest 3-bedroom house. He complimented my woodworking, asked thoughtful questions about my career, called me Mr. Hale with a formality that felt less like respect and more like distance. The careful politeness of a man keeping something at arm's length even while smiling at it. I told myself I was being unfair. Not every man needs to be effusive to be genuine. The first real incident came in July at a birthday dinner for Claire at a restaurant downtown. I noticed partway through the meal that Dean's phone rang twice, and both times he stepped outside to take the call. Returning with a tightness around his mouth, he tried to smile away. When Claire asked lightly who kept calling, he waved it off. "Just work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." She let it go. I noticed she'd asked the question the way you ask something you already suspect you won't get an honest answer to. August brought the second incident, sharper than the first. Claire came to Sunday dinner alone. Dean was traveling for work, she said, though something in how quickly she offered the explanation made me doubt it needed offering at all. Partway through the meal, I asked gently how things were going with him. Good, she said, too fast. He's got a lot going on right now. His family's really involved in his life, his mother especially. She has a lot of opinions about who he should be seen with, professionally, and I don't know, personally too, I guess. Personally meaning you? Claire pushed food around her plate without answering directly. It's complicated, Dad. His family's kind of a big deal in certain circles. He says once he's more established, once he's made partner, things will be different, easier. I just have to be patient. I sat with that phrase, I just have to be patient, turning it over in my mind long after she'd gone home that night. In 31 years of walking a mail route, I delivered enough letters to enough houses to recognize the particular shape of a woman waiting for a man's timeline to align with her own worth. I didn't like recognizing it in my daughter's voice. September brought the third incident at a work event Claire's firm hosted. One of the rare occasions I saw Dean and Claire together in a larger group. I watched him introduce her to colleagues throughout the evening, sometimes as my girlfriend Claire, sometimes confusingly, simply as a friend of mine. The inconsistency landing differently, depending, it seemed, on who was in the conversation. I watched Claire's face each time it happened. A small flinch, quickly smoothed over, the practiced recovery of someone who had learned not to make a scene about something that stung. Later that night, walking her to her car, I asked her about it directly. I noticed he introduced you differently to different people tonight. It's not a big deal, Dad. Some of those people are, like, his family's business contacts. It's complicated with his family. I told you that. It sounded pretty simple to me. Either you're his girlfriend or you're not. Claire's face tightened in a way I rarely saw from her. Defensive, exhausted. You don't understand what it's like, dating someone whose whole family has expectations. It's not like when you and Mom met. Things are different now. I just need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. I let it go that night. The way I let go of the incident in July and the incident in August, telling myself each time that a father who pushes too hard risks losing the very access he needs to actually help. I want to be honest about that decision because I've thought about it many times since. There is a version of fatherhood that mistakes silence for respect, that convinces itself patience is a virtue when really it's fear wearing a nicer word. October brought the fourth incident, and it's the one that finally cracked something open in me. Claire called on a Wednesday evening, and I could hear immediately that she'd been crying, though she tried to disguise it behind a falsely bright tone. Dad, hey, quick question. Is it okay if I come stay at your place this weekend? Just need a change of scenery. Of course. Everything okay? Yeah, totally fine. Dean and I just had a disagreement. It's nothing. A pause, too long to be nothing. He gets really stressed about his career stuff, and sometimes I think I get caught in the middle of it. You know, like he takes it out on me a little without meaning to. It's not a big deal. He apologized. What did he say to you, Claire? Another pause. He said some stuff about how I don't really understand the pressure he's under, how I make things harder instead of easier sometimes, how maybe I'm not. She stopped herself. It doesn't matter. It's fine. I'm probably overreacting. You don't sound like you're overreacting. You sound like someone who's been made to feel small." She didn't answer that directly, and I didn't push further that night, though the phrase sat with me for days afterward. Maybe I'm not. Not enough. Not right for him. Not what his family wanted. I could hear the sentence she hadn't finished as clearly as if she had. By November, the fifth incident arrived at a family Thanksgiving I'd hosted, my sister Linda and her husband driving up from Cincinnati to join us. Dean came briefly before leaving early for a family obligation he didn't elaborate on. Before he left, Linda, making innocent conversation, asked when we might get to meet his parents properly. "Soon," Dean said, smiling in that polished way of his. "My mother's just particular about timing, about who she meets when. She likes to feel things are settled before she invests emotionally, you know? Nothing personal to your family, of course." The sentence landed in the room like something cold. Claire's smile in response was thin and practiced, the smile of someone absorbing a small cruelty in front of witnesses and choosing not to make it bigger than it already was. After he left, Linda caught my eye across the table, and I could see she'd registered exactly what I had. A young woman being quietly told in front of her own family that she wasn't yet worth the trouble of a proper introduction. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, running through 5 months of small moments the way I used to run through a mail route, methodically, one house at a time, until the pattern of a whole street became clear. Isolation from a straightforward relationship status, public inconsistency and casual humiliation, a family holding her at arm's length while a son kept her close enough to use, but not close enough to claim. I didn't have a name yet for what I was watching happen to my daughter. I only knew, sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, that something in it was deeply wrong, and that I had spent 5 months telling myself to be patient while my daughter grew smaller in front of me. It was a Tuesday in December when I found the test in my trash can, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because the smallest details of that morning are burned into me in a way few things have been since Diane's accident. Claire had stayed over the previous night, an ordinary visit. She said she needed to grab something from her childhood bedroom for a project at work, and we'd ended up sharing a pizza and watching an old movie, the kind of easy evening we hadn't had together in months. She left before I woke the next morning, a note on the counter thanking me for dinner. Nothing seemed unusual. I was taking out the kitchen trash later that morning, an ordinary chore, the kind of thing you do without thinking, muscle memory built over decades, when the bag caught on the edge of the bin and tore slightly, spilling a few items across the floor of my garage. I bent to gather them, annoyed at the small mess, and my hand closed around a small plastic object I registered in the half second before my mind fully processed it as nothing more than trash. Then I saw what it was. A pregnancy test. 2 clear pink lines. I stood there in my garage for what felt like a very long time, holding it, my mind refusing at first to connect what I was looking at with my daughter's visit the night before. Then the pieces assembled themselves with a kind of terrible clarity. The note on the counter thanking me too warmly for an ordinary dinner. The slightly too long hug she'd given me before leaving. Something in her eyes the previous evening that I'd registered as tiredness, and now understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, might have been something closer to fear. My hands were shaking by the time I set the test down on my workbench. I sat on an overturned bucket in my own garage, a place that had always felt like the most peaceful room in my house, and felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't felt since the night the police came to my door about Diane. Not grief, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The specific, disorienting shock of realizing your child has been carrying something enormous, alone, in a house that was supposed to be the one place she never had to. I called her 3 times that day. Each time, it went to voicemail. By evening, I'd convinced myself of a dozen different explanations, each one worse than the last, that she was in trouble and didn't know how to tell me, that she'd made this decision without me knowing anything about it at all, that whatever was happening between her and Dean had reached a point I hadn't fully understood the danger of. She finally called back that night, her voice careful in a way that told me she already knew what I'd found. "Dad, I saw you called a few times. Everything okay?" I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, deciding how to say what needed saying. In 31 years of delivering news to people's doorsteps, some of it wonderful, some of it devastating, I'd learned that the gentlest way to say a hard thing is usually just to say it plainly. "Claire, I found a pregnancy test in my trash this morning. I'm not upset with you. I just need to know you're okay, and I need to know why you didn't feel like you could tell me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had broken entirely, all the careful control gone. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to... I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for 2 weeks, and I just couldn't. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how you'd..." "Sweetheart, breathe. I'm not going anywhere. Come over. Right now. Tonight. We'll figure this out together." "Dean doesn't want me to tell anyone yet," she said, and something in the way she said it, small, apologetic, deferring to his timeline over her own need for her father, told me everything I needed to know about how far things had gone in the 8 months since that networking event. "He says it's not the right time. With his career stuff, his family stuff, he needs to figure some things out first before we..." "Claire, this isn't his decision to make about whether your own father knows something this important about your life. Come home." She was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she finally said, her voice small. "I'm coming." Claire arrived at my house just past 9 that night, and the conversation we had at my kitchen table over the following 2 hours is one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The moment my daughter finally let 8 months of careful performance fall away and told me, in halting, exhausted honesty, everything she'd been carrying alone. She was 9 weeks along. She'd known for 3 of them. Dean's initial reaction when she told him had been a long, tense silence, followed by a list of practical concerns. His upcoming partnership review at the firm, his mother's expectations, the optics, he'd called it, of an unplanned pregnancy with a woman his family hadn't even properly met yet. He hadn't asked her how she felt. He hadn't asked what she wanted. He'd told her, calmly and with the same polished confidence I'd watched him wear at every dinner, that they needed to handle this carefully, and that for now it would be better if no one else knew. Not her father, not his family, not anyone, until he'd had time to figure out the right approach. "I kept telling myself he was just being practical," Claire said, staring into a mug of tea that had long gone cold. "That it was smart to wait, to have a plan before we told people. But it's been 3 weeks, Dad, and every time I bring up telling you, he has a new reason why it's not the right time yet. And I started to realize I don't think there's ever going to be a right time for him. I think he's hoping if he waits long enough, I'll just handle it myself, quietly, so he doesn't have to. I didn't say what I was thinking in that moment, that I already had a fairly clear picture of exactly what kind of man does this to a woman he claims to care about. Because Claire didn't need my anger that night. She needed steadiness. So I gave her that instead, and I made her a promise I intended to keep, that whatever she decided about this pregnancy was entirely her own decision, that I would support her completely regardless of what she chose, and that no man's career timeline had any claim on that choice. Over the following days, though, my old instincts, the quiet, watchful ones, honed over 3 decades of noticing things about the people on my route before they announced them to the world, started working on a different question. Something about Dean's insistence on secrecy had felt, from the beginning, less like practical caution and more like a man protecting something specific. I called my old friend Walt Brennan, a retired police detective I'd known since high school, and asked him over coffee whether he could help me look into a few things about a young man named Dean Ashford. What Walt found over the following 10 days confirmed a fear I'd been circling without letting myself land on it. Dean's position at his family's law firm was real, but far less secure than he'd represented. A partnership review coming up in the spring that colleagues described, off the record, as not a sure thing. His billable hours reportedly a persistent point of tension with the senior partners. More troubling was something Walt found almost by accident, scrolling through a local society page covering a charity gala the previous month. A photograph of Dean at the event, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. A modest but unmistakable engagement ring visible on her hand. The caption identified her as Dean's fiancée. I sat with that photograph for a long time before deciding how to use it. I want to be honest. My first instinct, the old protective instinct that had sat quietly in me through 5 months of watching my daughter grow smaller, was to drive to Dean's office and end this the way a man of a different temperament might have. I didn't do that. I've never believed a father protects his daughter by becoming the kind of man who frightens people into silence. What Claire needed wasn't a father who created a scene. She needed the truth, delivered carefully, and the space to decide what to do with it herself. I called Linda first, the way I always did when I needed to think something through out loud with someone who loved Claire as much as I did. "You have to tell her," Linda said without hesitation. "Gently, but you have to. She deserves to know exactly who she's dealing with before she makes any decisions about her future or the babies." I agreed, but I wanted to be careful about how. I didn't want Claire to hear this news from a place of anger or vindication. I wanted her to hear it in a way that made clear this wasn't about proving Dean was a bad man, but about making sure she had every piece of the truth before she decided anything else. I sat her down 2 days later at my kitchen table again and laid it out plainly. The photograph, the caption, the engagement Walt had confirmed through a public record search that showed the marriage license application had already been filed. I watched Claire's face move through disbelief, then a kind of numb stillness, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of a person who has spent weeks sensing a truth they couldn't quite name, finally seeing it confirmed in daylight. I kept thinking if I was just patient enough, understanding enough about his career stress, it would get better, she said quietly. I never once thought it might be because there was someone else the whole time. You don't owe him any more patience, sweetheart. Not after this. We spent the following week building a plan. Carefully, Claire consulted an attorney Walt recommended about her rights and options moving forward, documented every message and conversation with Dean regarding the pregnancy, and made the decision entirely her own to keep the baby and raise the child independently, with my full support behind her. What remained was one final conversation, the one where Dean needed to hear, plainly and without ambiguity, that his secret had been found, and that hiding from this truth was no longer an option available to him. Claire asked me to be there when she told him. I agreed on one condition, that whatever needed saying, she would say first, and I would only step in if it became necessary. She agreed. We met Dean at my house on a Saturday afternoon in late December. Claire's request, rather than a location of ambush, a place she said felt safer to her than his apartment or anywhere his family might unexpectedly appear. He arrived expecting, I think, a difficult but manageable conversation about timelines and next steps. The same careful management he'd been practicing for weeks. He was not prepared for the pregnancy test on my counter, or for the folder Claire set down beside it, containing a printed copy of the gala photograph and the public record of his marriage license application. "Where did you get that?" he said, staring at the test. And I watched the calculation move across his face as he tried to determine how much I already knew. "Out of my own trash can," I said, keeping my voice level. "Which tells me my daughter was standing in my kitchen, alone, holding the biggest news of her life, and too afraid to tell her own father. I'd like you to explain to me why that is." He tried to recover, the polish sliding back into place. "Robert, I don't know what Claire's told you, but this is between us. It's not something you need to—" "She's my daughter," I said. "Everything about her life is something I need to know, and so is this." I slid the folder across the counter toward him. He looked down at it, and for the first time since I'd met him, I watched every practiced confidence drain out of his face at once. "Claire," he started, turning to her, "I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me," Claire said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness I hadn't heard from her in months. "I already know everything I need to know. You've been engaged to someone else this entire time. You told me to keep our baby a secret from my own father while you were planning a wedding with another woman. I don't need an explanation, Dean. I need you to leave." "It's not what it looks like," he said, though the words came out weak, unconvincing even to himself. "Sarah and we've been having problems. I was going to end it. I just needed the right time." "There's never a right time with you," Claire said. "That's the one thing I've finally figured out. There's always a reason to wait, a reason to hide, a reason it's not the right moment. I'm done waiting for your right moment to matter more than my own life." He looked at me then, perhaps hoping to find an ally in the room, some appeal to reasonableness between two men. He found nothing of the sort. "You need to understand," I said, my voice calm but final, "that whatever happens next, with this baby, with my daughter's life, none of it requires your permission or your timeline anymore. You've made your choices. She's made hers. The only thing left for you to do is leave with whatever dignity you have left, and never make my daughter feel small again." "This is insane," he said, gathering himself, reaching for anger now that charm had failed him. "You're acting like I'm some kind of villain. I have a career to think about, a family with expectations. "You have a child on the way," I said, "who deserves better than a father who hid its existence out of embarrassment. That's not a career consideration. That's a character one." He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there for a long moment, and I watched something in him finally understand that the room had turned entirely against the version of events he'd been managing for weeks. Without another word, he picked up the folder, set it back down as if touching it too long might make the truth in it more real, and walked out of my house. Claire didn't cry until the door closed behind him. Then she sat down at my kitchen table and let out a sound I recognized, not the sharp grief of losing something valuable, but the exhausted release of finally putting down a weight she'd been carrying alone for months. "I can't believe I almost let him talk me into hiding this from you," she said. "I can't believe how small I let myself become, trying to fit into whatever version of me he was willing to introduce to people." "You found your way out," I told her. "That's what matters now." The weeks following that Saturday afternoon moved faster than I expected, in some ways, and slower in others, the way significant change in a family usually does. Dean's engagement, once Claire's situation became known within their shared professional circles, not through any deliberate effort on our part, but through the ordinary machinery of small-town professional gossip, became a subject of considerable scrutiny at his firm. His fiancée, Sarah, learned the full truth within days, and the engagement dissolved shortly after, though I take no particular satisfaction in that outcome. It wasn't revenge I was after in any of this. It was simply the truth finding its way to daylight, the way truth eventually does when enough people stop protecting the lie. His partnership review, already tenuous according to what Walt had uncovered, did not go in his favor that spring. I heard, secondhand through Linda's connections in the city's legal community, that he eventually left the firm entirely, moving to a smaller practice in a different city. I felt no need to track the details further than that. His life, whatever shape it took next, was no longer any concern of mine. Claire's reaction in those first weeks moved through stages I recognized from watching people process genuine shock. First, a kind of brittle efficiency, throwing herself into practical preparations for the baby with an intensity that worried me slightly, because I recognized it as a way of not sitting still with her feelings. Then, about 2 weeks later, it broke properly. A full evening of crying on my couch, asking questions that had no easy answers. How did I let this go on for 8 months? Why did I keep making excuses for him? What does it say about me that I almost hid this from my own father? I told her the truth I'd learned from 31 years of watching families up close from their front porches. The people who are skilled at this kind of quiet manipulation are skilled precisely because it doesn't announce itself as manipulation. It arrives dressed as practicality, as career pressure, as family expectation, as reasonable caution. "You didn't miss something obvious," I told her. "You missed something built carefully to be missed. That's not a failure in you. That's a skill in him, an ugly one." Linda and her husband became a steady presence in those weeks, driving up from Cincinnati more often than usual. And Claire's closest friend from college, a woman named Priya, who I'd always liked, resumed a closeness with Claire that I gathered had been quietly strained during the months Dean had occupied so much of her attention. Claire's co-workers at the design firm, once she felt ready to share her situation, turned out to be a source of genuine support. Her manager quietly adjusting her project load to give her more flexibility as her pregnancy progressed. I noticed my own aftermath too, in ways I hadn't fully expected. The old watchfulness that had guided 31 years of noticing quiet trouble on my route came back sharper than before, and I found myself checking in on Claire more frequently than either of us probably needed, driving past her apartment on evening walks more often than coincidence explained, replaying the 8 months of small incidents I'd noticed and hesitated over, wondering what might have been different if I'd spoken up sooner in July or August or September. Linda gently pointed out one evening that I was doing to myself exactly what I used to caution new mail carriers against, staying in a permanent state of high alert long after the actual danger had passed. "You found it, Robert," she said. "You helped her see it. Now you have to let yourself trust that she's going to be okay." That was harder to accept than any confrontation had been. A month after that Saturday in my kitchen, Claire and I settled into a new rhythm, steadier than before, built with more honesty between us than we'd managed in months. She started coming to Sunday dinner again, with a different quality to her presence, more open, more willing to talk through what she was feeling instead of performing that everything was fine. One evening, over dishes, she asked me how I'd known something was wrong before she ever told me anything directly. "I've spent 31 years noticing quiet trouble on people's front porches," I told her. "I recognized the shape of it in you before I had words for what I was seeing." She listened to that, the way you listen when you're trying to understand not just an explanation, but the whole shape of the person offering it. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Claire began seeing a counselor recommended by her obstetrician, a therapist who specialized in supporting women navigating unplanned pregnancies and difficult relationship transitions. Her therapist used a term Claire repeated to me one Sunday: anticipatory shame, the specific fear of a partner's disapproval that leads a person to hide even good news out of dread for how it might be received. Hearing the clinical name for what she'd experienced seemed to help her the way my own watchfulness had helped me, turning a confusing tangle of feelings into something with edges, something she could name and therefore begin to release. By February, 2 months out, I noticed the smaller signs of her settling into her own strength. She began attending a prenatal class on her own, proud in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's approval but her own, and started designing, in her spare hours, a small collection of nursery illustrations that she eventually turned into a modest side business, something entirely hers. She and Priya spent an entire weekend together shopping for the baby, filling my garage, since Claire's apartment had limited storage, with boxes of tiny clothes and a crib I insisted on assembling myself, grateful for the first time in months to have sawdust and simple work to occupy my hands again. By March, 3 months out, Claire told me she'd started dating again. People sometimes ask me, hearing this story, whether I regret the months I spent noticing small warning signs and choosing patience over confrontation. Telling myself a father who pushes too hard risks losing the daughter he's trying to protect. I've turned that question over many times, and here is where I've landed. I don't regret giving Claire room to reach her own understanding in her own time. I do regret how much silence cost her along the way, and I think often about the balance between respecting a grown child's independence and staying close enough to catch her when the ground gives way beneath her. I don't believe there's a perfect formula for that balance. I believe you pay attention even when it's uncomfortable. You trust the small things you notice even when you can't yet name them, and you make absolutely certain the people you love Always know there is a door open to you the moment they're ready to walk through it. 31 years of walking the same 6 miles taught me how to notice quiet trouble in other people's lives long before they spoke a word of it aloud. It took my own daughter and the hardest winter of my life since losing my wife to teach me that noticing isn't enough on its own. You have to be willing to act on what you see, gently, without judgment, and with nothing but her well-being guiding every step you take next. If there's someone in your life right now who reminds you of Claire in this story, someone growing quieter, smaller, more careful around the edges of their own happiness because they're waiting for someone else's permission to matter, I'd ask you to do what I wish I'd done a little sooner. Pay attention to what isn't being said, and when the moment comes that you're needed, be ready to sit down at the table with them, steady and unhurried, and simply ask the honest question. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear it today. You never know which trash can, which quiet Tuesday morning might be waiting to reveal a truth someone you love has been carrying alone. Thank you for listening.